In this clip, I break down the new news that Brad Treliving has been fired. I break down some of his earlier moves, some of his later moves, and why I think he is no longer the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I touch on as well Keith Pelly's brand new press conference that just happened live. All of that is coming up next. I appreciate you tuning in, and thanks for watching. Starting off with Treliving, look, the timing was weird. The timing was really weird, but I think it's a good indicator. It happened right before a very crucial game, and a game that I hope can change the dynamic of this culture that the Maple Leafs have built over the last 10 years. And obviously the Matthews hit, obviously with the MCL, was egregious. The no response was heavy, and that was, for me, signaling a change needed to start. I actually believe that hit alone could have emphasized the firing of Treliving, because the Leafs kind of realized that they need to do something here. They need to push for more for this fan base and give them something to really look forward to in terms of what's going to change here. Why is it that Austin Matthews is getting his MCL torn out by Radko Gudas, the same guy who screamed in Joseph Wall's face in a playoff series? There should be bad blood there already. It just doesn't seem like this team seems to understand it the same way that other teams do in the National Hockey League. You know, looking earlier into Treliving's tenure, so when he came here, a lot of people forget, it was the whole emphasis on you need to get Matthews and Nylander signed. And now he's leaving, and I think it's a good variable to look at. Now it's going to be, are Austin Matthews or William Nylander getting traded in the offseason, which to me tells me everything you need to know about Brad Treliving's tenure and if it worked or not. The Matthews deal was a midterm deal. I actually think both the Matthews deal and the Nylander deal, Treliving deserves some credit for. I don't think the Matthews deal was much of a negotiation. I think Matthews gave him the term and said, I can work with the number, but the term is the term, and that's not going to go anywhere. The Nylander one, I felt, and I think a lot of Leaf fans felt, it was an overpay at the beginning, but Nylander, when he really broke through in the first half of that year, was able to maintain that pretty nicely, and he's been really good for them. And I don't really think there's any complaints on the contract. Maybe the fit. Obviously, there's the whole thing this year where he was, all the antics and the middle finger situation, but that doesn't have anything to do with his contract. His contract, in my opinion, is perfectly fine, and he's really excelled as a player. From, if you even look a year before he was signed, he was probably teetering at an $8 or $9 million player, and he's really got himself to an $11.5 million player at this point. That was the two main pieces that Treliving wanted to get done, and he got those things done. The one thing that he didn't do was fire Sheldon Keefe, who obviously was Kyle Dubas' hire. He lets him play out the year, which in my opinion was the first big mistake. And I think this was all the strategic motivation from Treliving, to where he knew that was a bullet that he can use. Why would he use it when he just got in? Why not give it a year? And if you lose, you can say, oh, here's my first bullet, Sheldon Keefe, you're gone. And I think that's what Brad Treliving did. And I actually think Keefe did pretty well. I think he played into Treliving's philosophy pretty nicely. Treliving obviously wanted a bigger team, a heavier team, and I believe the Leafs that year were among the highest hitters or highest hit counts in the league. And I've always said, I look back on that team, I look at a guy like Noah Gregor. I'm not sure how many of those hits were legitimate hits. When you have Noah Gregor getting, I think there was a time he was getting like 6 to 10 bumps a game that were just being counted as hits. I think there was a lot of those stat padding on the Maple Leafs in terms of physicality, and then you look at what they brought in at the deadline, which was Treliving's first deadline when it was Lyubushkin and Edmondson. It just didn't feel like that team ever thought they were going to be that great, and Treliving knew he had time. He had the ability to fire Keefe at the end of the year. He didn't go in at the deadline. He paid a third for Lyubushkin, and he got him at $687,000 or whatever it was. He got Joel Edmondson, and he got Connor Dewar, which Connor Dewar did not end up working out, but that was Treliving's first deadline. It doesn't end up working in the playoffs, even though they come down from 3-1 through adversity, and that was that in terms of the first year of Brad Treliving. And we move on to the next year. And then we see the hiring of Craig Berube, and this was what a lot of Leaf fans wanted to see. We just witnessed a tenure in the Maple Leafs culture where they were soft and they didn't have championship pedigree. So you're able to bring in this coach who's won the Stanley Cup, and he's done it on teams that haven't had many superstars. You look back on the St. Louis Blues, and it was Ryan O'Reilly leading the way. But I think one thing that I'm confident in saying now, now that the Craig Berube tenure is looking like it's coming to an end, is Craig Berube had Alex Pietrangelo and Colton Parayko and Jordan Binnington on the backside of his team defending. And that's one thing the Maple Leafs don't have. They don't have a horse that they can ride on the back end. Jake McCabe this year struggled. Chris Tanev this year was injured. Brandon Carlo did not perform the way that the Maple Leafs had hoped. And Joseph Woll and Anthony Stolarz, although they were good, they were still inconsistent with their injuries, and they are not Jordan Binnington in terms of what Jordan Binnington was, at the time of the Stanley Cup win. So I think the Berube hire it's tough for me to say I think it was bad because it's what everybody wanted and it's what made sense in terms of where the Maple Leafs wanted to go in terms of playing a harder style. But I just don't think Berube and stylistically the team made sense together. And that's where I have a problem with Treliving again, because you're the one who's giving Berube the players. And I'll point out the Scott Laughton trade. You paid a first-round pick and Nikita Gurbenkin for Scott Laughton. And then you decided to Berube used him on the fourth line, never really giving him any promotions, and then you tanked his value, and a year later you're flipping him for a third-round pick. I find that to be a disconnection between the GM and the coach. One positive I would say is he was able to bring in Anthony Stolarz, who's been great for them. He was able to bring in Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Chris Tanev. So breaking down those signings, Chris Tanev obviously was one of the best defensive defensemen in the NHL last year. But a 6-year deal for a guy who is a year and a half into that at this point and already looks like he's done, that was risky. Okay, and honestly, I think the value was there. I saw the vision, and it depends how they're able to use Tanev. If they can LTIR him, sure. If they can find a way to maybe make him a third pair defenseman, as the cap rises, his $4.5 million cap, it doesn't really matter. As a third pair defenseman, then no problem. Oliver Ekman-Larsson signing, I did not like the signing when it happened because I thought that Oliver Ekman-Larsson kind of fell off in his career and he played on a really good Florida team and a really good system and a sheltered role, and we're going to give him almost $4 million. That sounds catastrophic, but he did really well in Toronto. I think, once the Maple Leafs kind of figured out getting him on his left side a little bit, getting him away from Simon Benoit, when Benoit's game started to slip last year and into this year as well, he really started to find his game too. So in terms of free agency, whether it was Bertuzzi or Domi or Reeves, that was the philosophy that everybody wanted. They wanted the grit factor. He came in and he did that. In free agency, the Leafs needed defensemen. He brought in Ekman-Larsson and Tanev, which was great. Obviously, the downsides was the contract lengths and the age there, but he did what he had to do. I honestly cannot complain with that to a great extent. He also was able to bring in Anthony Stolarz and also retain him under $4 million, and also retaining Joseph Woll under $4 million. I know people don't love those signings, but honestly, goaltending is so inconsistent in the league. I have no problem with giving goaltenders who, when they are healthy, under $4 million. I'm not going to argue with that either. I think Treliving, one of his strengths was actually free agency. And this is when I'm going to switch over to trades, because for me, this is where Brad Treliving really hit the wall. Free agency was okay for me, but trades is where it hit the wall. Starting off, it was a 5th-round pick for Sam Lafferty. No problem there. Lafferty is a 4th liner. No problem. 5th-round pick. It is what it is. Next, it was the trade deadline, as I mentioned earlier. Ilya Lyubushkin for a 3rd. There was the Joel Edmondson trade. It was 50% retained, so that was even less retention than the Lyubushkin trade. So getting those guys for 3rd-round picks when you could get heavy retention is good work as well. Connor Dewar they got for a 4th-round pick, and Dmitry Ovechkinikov. That was a fine trade, but Connor Dewar just really didn't end up working out here. He was snake bitten. I still remember that Game 7 breakaway he had against Boston that year, but he's went to Pittsburgh under Kyle Dubas and he's found his game. So good for Connor Dewar, but it just didn't work out here in Toronto. I can't really blame Treliving. I think Connor Dewar was actually a really good pickup. Before he came to Toronto, he was more of the player he was in Pittsburgh. Great analytics, a little bit of goal scoring, a pesky small forward, but still he played not small, and it just didn't work in Toronto for whatever reason. I can't blame Treliving too much for that. It is what it is. And then you had a situation where Timothy Liljegren wasn't working out in Toronto, and you decided to flip him for a 3rd-round pick and Matt Benning. And if you recall, Timothy Liljegren was on a $3 million deal that was signed the same offseason that they got Ekman-Larsson and Tanev. It didn't end up working out. I like that they tried to give Timothy Liljegren one more shot. It just didn't end up working out in Toronto, and he got decent value. Matt Benning is just a depth defenseman that's played a few games for them, but mostly the Marlies, and the 3rd-round pick is a 3rd-round pick. Liljegren was making $3 million. That is a hefty amount for Timothy Liljegren, and that was a fine trade in my opinion. And all hell breaks loose because we get to last year's trade deadline where Scott Laughton and the Brandon Carlo trades were done, and I've said it maybe 50 times, the Scott Laughton trade is such a perfect example of terrible asset management to acquire a player for a 1st-round pick and Nikita Grabenkin. You got the salary retention to 1.5, which is great value. You got the year after at 1.52, which is great value, obviously. And you'd use him in a fourth-line role, and his teammates were always Steven Lorentz, Kelly Yarncroke, or defensively inefficient players like Max Domi or Nick Robertson. You never assembled a checking line where Scott Laughton would have been able to excel. You end up tanking his value because you're not playing a player where he excels, and then you flip him a year later for a third-round pick because now he's a free agent. It's just terrible management all around. But maybe even worse was the Brandon Carlo trade for Fraser Minten and a first-round pick, and I have vouched for this trade many times in favor of Brad Treliving. I think that Fraser Minten at the time was seen as a third-line center who's maybe going to put up 40 to 45 to maybe 50 points, and then that first-round pick was going to be a late first-round pick because the Maple Leafs were great that year, and you never expected them to fall off the way they did. If you can acquire a right-hand shot defenseman who is 6'5", over 200 pounds, he's long, he's big, he's only 28 years old at the time, and he had a good contract with salary retention on top. It was below $4 million. That is such an incredible asset. But the reality was the signs were there that Brandon Carlo was starting to slip a little bit. And you just got unlucky with the fact that Fraser Minten is looking like he might be a second-line center. And then you obviously fell off this year. And the first-round pick is going to be maybe even a top 5 pick, in which that case the Maple Leafs would keep it. But it would still affect you in the future when you have to forfeit more first-round picks because you got to keep it. But if it ends up being 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th overall, that's going to be a very bad trade for the Maple Leafs if it isn't already. But for me, it's not the right move, and there was reports that came out that Treliving only reached out to Boston an hour before the trade deadline, the actual time where they couldn't make any more trades, and they didn't really get to negotiate too much, and the Leafs just kind of ponied up. You know, you never know what hand Brendan Shanahan had in that in terms of wanting to make that trade, or maybe even a Keith Pelly, but it is what it is. It was a terrible trade at the end of the day, and sometimes I feel bad for general managers because hindsight wins, but that trade probably should not have happened, and if that's the way that the process was, then you have to fault Treliving for it. And then you get into the offseason, they lose to the Panthers in Game 7, and you let Mitch Marner go, but you get Nicholas Waugh. That was a fantastic move. Treliving could not do anything about the Mitch Marner situation, okay? This is one of the things I will defend Treliving on. He tried to trade Mitch Marner so many different times, and it just didn't budge. He did his best there, in my opinion. Tried to do so many different things, and Mitch Marner's no-trade clause was not going to budge. That was an issue with Dubas and Shanahan more than it was Treliving. So within hindsight, we see Nicholas Waugh come to Toronto, be a really solid third-line center who has tons of value because he's right-handed. He is only at making $3 million, and they were able to flip him for a first-round pick at this year's trade deadline. That was a fantastic move and a great condition for the Mitch Marner trade in which you were at least able to get something. And then there was the Matias Maccelli trade, which was obviously in result of trying to replace the playmaking ability of Mitch Marner. And I thought Maccelli was great for the Maple Leafs this year. I really do. Obviously, again, here's the miscohesion between Craig Berube and Brad Treliving, where this is a player that was healthy scratch for so many games. You bring him back into the lineup, and he looks like an NHL player that's going to be really solid, still rather young, I believe 25, 26 years old. I think that was a solid trade for Brad Treliving. The Henry Thrun trade for Ryan Reeves is what it is. Treliving obviously tried to bring in Reeves to try to change this culture, change this narrative, and would you look at that, Matthews getting his MCL torn with no response. Ryan Reeves, Treliving tried there, right? But Ryan Reeves is not going to be able to change the culture on his own. It's going to come from the players like the Nylanders, like the Matthews, like the Knies and the Tavares, and that is what it is. But he tried to bring in a guy, maybe the toughest guy in the league at the time or one of the toughest guys, to try to change that. It just didn't work. Ended up being a bad contract. You flip him for Henry Thrun, a depth defenseman, and, you know, that is what it is there as well. Then there was a Dakota Joshua trade for a fourth-round pick. Joshua was a nice get. He's a power forward. He had testicular cancer, which is why his numbers were deflated. And then this year, injuries as well. He's a player that I expect the Maple Leafs to hold on to. I think he's a good fourth liner and potentially a third liner in a pinch. He's a solid player. I don't have a problem with that at the end of the day. So in result, I don't really think that Brad Treliving hit any trade on the list here out of the park, right? There's more bad trades than good trades, and there's obviously the detrimental trades of Scott Laughton and Brandon Carlo, but I still believe that those two trade deadlines is what ended the Brad Treliving tenure, because you cannot bring back a general manager that has that much miscohesion between the coach and himself and making moves like that. He shouldn't really get the chance to redo that, in my opinion. He made tons of trades, tons of signings. It didn't work out. The Leafs are absolutely awful this year. It's time for a new voice, and that is what they're going to end up doing. One last tidbit. I was a little bit confused with Keith Pelly because he said that he's not going to get involved with the Maple Leafs, but then he reiterated that he is not interested in a rebuild or tanking, which to me seems a little bit contradicting. So I think this next hire is going to be very important. We just saw Jim Nill get off the market. The Dallas Stars re-signed him. I'm looking at Doug Armstrong, but I think the Maple Leafs are going to do their due diligence and do a wide search here. And I think that we could see a rookie GM potentially come in for the Maple Leafs. But obviously the two trade deadlines and the Scotland trade and the Brandon Carlo trade is what really ended it, in my opinion, for Brad Treliving in Toronto. And I'm curious to see if Brad Treliving will catch a job somewhere else. But for now, the Maple Leafs have a GM vacancy to worry about, and Brad Treliving is no longer the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs.